Right now, in hospitals all over the world, there are infections that no drug on earth can stop. Bacteria that have learned to survive everything we throw at them. Doctors have a name for them now. Superbugs. And here's the scary part. We are slowly running out of ways to fight back. Which is strange when you really think about it. Because the weapon that started this entire war, the one that's now beginning to fail, was never invented on purpose. A scientist discovered it because he was messy. Because he forgot to clean up before he went on holiday. I'm not exaggerating. The most important medicine in human history, a drug that has saved somewhere around 200 million lives, exists because one man didn't tidy his lab. Let me tell you what really happened, because honestly, it's one of my favorite stories in all of science. It's 1928, London, a hospital called St. Mary's. And in one cramped, cluttered little laboratory works a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming. Now, I have to be honest with you about Fleming. He was brilliant, but he was also famously, hopelessly messy. His lab was a disaster. Stacks of old dishes everywhere, experiments he hadn't gotten around to cleaning. If you've ever had a co-worker whose desk makes you a little anxious, that was Fleming times 10. And in the summer of 1928, he does what a lot of us do. He goes on holiday. He leaves a pile of petri dishes sitting out. Dishes covered in staphylococcus, a nasty bacteria that can genuinely kill you. And he just leaves them there for 2 weeks. Now stop and think about that. When you imagine a great discovery, you picture years of careful planning. This one started with a guy leaving dirty dishes out and walking out the door. When he comes back in September, he starts sorting through the mess. And he notices something on one of the plates. A blob of mold has drifted in from somewhere and started growing on the dish. Which, on its own, is nothing. Mold on an old plate. Any normal person tosses it in the bin without a second thought. But Fleming looks closer. And here's the moment. Around that blob of mold, there's a clear ring. A little empty zone where the deadly bacteria simply isn't there anymore. Everywhere else, the stuff is thriving. But right next to the mold, nothing. Dead. Clean. Something in that mold was killing the bacteria. And this is the part I love. Fleming didn't throw it away. He didn't shrug it off. He later summed the whole thing up in one line. One sometimes finds what one is not looking for. Objective: study a common bacteria. Result: accidentally discover the thing that kills it. He identified the mold. It came from a family called penicillium. So he named the mysterious bacteria-killing substance after it, penicillin. He published his findings in 1929, and then almost nothing happened. Here's what nobody tells you about this story. Fleming's discovery didn't change the world overnight. It just sat there for years. Because there was a problem. Fleming could see the mold-killed bacteria, but he couldn't actually extract it, purify it, or make enough of it to treat a single sick person. The stuff was fragile and painfully hard to produce. He tried, he struggled, and eventually he basically gave up and moved on to other work. Think about how wild that is. The cure was sitting right there, on a dish, in a drawer, and for about a decade, the world almost lost it. Honestly, I find that haunting. How many world-changing ideas have been found and then quietly forgotten just because the timing wasn't right? But this one got a second chance, because about 10 years later, at Oxford, 2 more scientists stumbled onto Fleming's old ignored paper. An Australian named Howard Florey and a German-born biochemist named Ernst Chain, who, by the way, had fled Nazi Germany to get there. And they asked the question Fleming couldn't answer. Can we actually turn this into a real drug? With a brilliant colleague named Norman Heatley, they started trying to purify penicillin. And I mean improvising the entire way. They were so short on equipment, they grew the mold in whatever they could find. Bottles, tins, even hospital bedpans. In 1940, they ran the test that mattered. They took 25 mice and infected all of them with a deadly dose of bacteria. Then they gave penicillin to only half. The next morning, the untreated mice were dead. The treated mice were alive and well. That was the moment they knew this could save people. And then came the human being who breaks my heart every time. His name was Albert Alexander, an Oxford policeman.
He had a small scratch that had turned into a massive, life-threatening infection. The kind that, in 1941, was basically a death sentence. They gave him the penicillin, and he started to recover. This dying man began coming back to life. It was working. It was actually working. And then they ran out. That was the whole tragedy. They had so little penicillin, they couldn't make more fast enough. They even collected and reused what they could from his own body, and it still wasn't enough. The infection came roaring back, and Albert Alexander died. Sit with that for a second. They had the cure. They watched it work with their own eyes, and they lost him anyway. Not because the science failed, but because they couldn't make enough of it in time. So that became the real mission. Not, does it work? They knew it worked. The mission was, make enough of it to save everyone. And here's where the story gets almost funny. With England being bombed during the war, Florey and Heatley traveled to America to scale it up. And the strain of mold that finally made mass production possible? Researchers found it on a rotten cantaloupe, a moldy melon from a market in Peoria, Illinois. The drug that would save hundreds of millions of lives got its big break thanks to a piece of grocery store fruit somebody almost threw in the trash. By 1944, they'd cracked it. American factories were pumping out penicillin on a massive scale. And the timing could not have been more important, because it arrived just in time for the bloodiest years of the Second World War. Wounds that would have killed soldiers in the First World War, infections, blood poisoning, were suddenly survivable. The death rate from wound infections dropped from around 1 in 7 down to almost nothing. In 1945, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize. And in his acceptance speech, Fleming did something remarkable. At the height of the celebration, he warned everyone. He said if we used penicillin carelessly, too much, too often, the bacteria would learn. They would adapt. And one day, the drug might stop working. He called it, almost exactly, in 1945. Which brings us right back to where we started. Those superbugs in hospitals today? The infections we're struggling to treat right now. Fleming saw them coming 80 years ago, from the very beginning. So the next time you take an antibiotic, or you think of someone whose life was saved by one, remember where it came from. Not a grand plan, not a perfect lab. It came from a messy scientist who left his dishes out, a blob of mold that drifted through a window, a forgotten paper, a rotten melon, and a handful of people who refused to let a miracle die on a shelf. He didn't clean up, and because of that, millions of us are alive. The world wasn't built perfectly. Some of its greatest inventions were simply accidentally created.